hello to you too. Yes, thank you to my Trinita for asking me to come and talk to you. And my Trinita just allowed me to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. Not being a parent, I'm not going to talk about, or can't really talk about, how you might be Buddhist parents or better Buddhist parents. But I thought we could explore. Well, I was thinking of exploring something called reaction practice, which some of you may be familiar with, but I've found it a very helpful way of approaching my day-to-day, or practice in my day-to-day life, and of course when I can in meditation as well. So I thought that might be quite a helpful thing to start to explore, but I'm also open to anything else that you kind of want to explore, as long as it's not to do with how to be a parent, as long as it's something to do with the Dharma. I'm sort of open to seeing where we go with that. So first of all, let me see, are there any things that anybody has in mind that you particularly want to explore?
I guess something that I was talking about the concept of
God.
Yeah. Is something I struggle with my son is to explain to him, because again he's in quite a Christian school. He goes to church. How to kind of first steps in approaching spiritual understanding, which would be true of someone who's 25, who's never even thought about it, I guess. Obviously it's got to be age appropriate wording, but conceptually I struggle with it. I don't really understand. Because around 5 or 6, I think they have a really strong sense of death. And he's really going through that at the moment. Because lots of people, grandparents are dying, and his friends and things.
Well, when Arvind mentioned that, it did occur. I mean, I'll say a few things and then see if anybody else has got anything that might shed light on it. But when Arvind, you mentioned how do you communicate about something when your child's been taught about God? My initial response anyway was, I'm really sort of glad that any higher value is being communicated, if you see what I mean. I'm less bothered about the language that's used. If it is the language of God, well, initially at least that might not be such a bad thing. But it depends, I guess, where that language then goes. And I don't really know how Christian schools these days do it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that it feels to me really important that rather than a nihilistic framework, that we're open to, and our children are open to, something beyond death, something beyond this life, and that whatever is beyond life and death, and in Dharmic terms, whatever's beyond conditioned existence, is supremely positive. It's really, really positive. And it does, whatever that is, it does have attributes of love. And I think that's really, really important. Really, really important to stress. And of course in a theistic tradition that will be identified as God. Buddhism sees that as a limiting concept for a number of reasons. And it can be more than limiting, it can be a really unhelpful concept if that idea of God turns into some sort of judgmental entity, being that is going to punish and punish and the like. But if the idea that your children are being exposed to is more benign than that, then maybe until they're a bit older it's all right. Dharmic ideas are quite difficult to get across, even to adults. So I think it's much better that we have a sense that there is something sacred than not. We live in a very, very materialistic, nihilistic kind of culture, so the children, all of us are going to be exposed to that as well. That's a sort of initial kind of thought, but I don't know if any of you have got any other experiences, perhaps if you've got slightly older children or you've had this sense, this experience of your children being taught about God. Any thoughts?
I was just thinking that my family were Christians, and one of my younger brothers, because he was taught at school and from my parents, he kind of became very devout Christian himself.
Yes.
And I'm just thinking, when you're young and that's kind of taught to you, things kind of stay with you. So
right.
that fear that's taught, because it's kind of taught in a fearful way.
Right.
That kind of stays with you, and I'm just kind of thinking, because
that's not so healthy, is it?
Yeah, it's kind of there, regardless of how it's taught.
Yeah. So some of that will be there. I guess another approach would be to also counter that with Buddhist images and stories and teachings. If you can have that, your children exposed to that as well, to a shrine, to an image of the Buddha, to hearing about the Buddha and who the Buddha was. Where's Lydia gone? Lydia was saying, that you've been chanting the refuges and precepts, and that I don't know, if there's a certain sense of that at home as well, I think that can counter something. And then of course there'll come a question of what's the difference, or is the Buddha God, or and then I guess then you can be appropriate and try and sort of mitigate against if there are any harmful sort of things like fear being taught. It's a really fine line. I guess what I was getting at, and Subhuti was saying this some years ago, is that these days, he says, if people say to him that, if they talk in terms of theism, he's very hesitant to say that God doesn't exist or something like that, because I think that then implies that nothing exists beyond this material world. That's what the implication will be for a lot of people. They go from believing in a creator God to thinking Buddhism doesn't have anything like that, therefore Buddhism is just a human teaching. And actually, when the Dharma, when you open up to something beyond the conditioned, it's you can't grasp it. The reason the Buddha, I think Buddhism talks about God as limiting, is because God as a being still sort of is conceptualized in this world of beings, in this world of things. And what Buddhism's saying is that there's something beyond this subject and objective kind of way of subject and object, this dualistic way of perceiving. So you can't put God into it, because then you've just turned God into another object. But I was once at an interfaith, it was a Christian-Buddhist kind of dialogue. I've told this story before, and the then Archbishop of Canterbury was speaking. What was his name? What's his name?
Wasn't Justin, was it?
Sorry? No, before him. Rowan Williams, sorry, that's right. So Rowan Williams was addressing the audience, there was a panel of Buddhists and Rowan Williams, and it was at the Buddhist Society in London. And Rowan Williams, I thought, was everything he said I could completely agree with as a Buddhist. And what he said, and of course this won't necessarily be how Christianity is taught in schools, but he said that he didn't believe of God as a thing in a universe of things. He saw it more as, I think he used the terms intimacy with life. And he was talking about the Heart Sutra and the Metta Sutta. And so what he was doing was drawing on the Christian mystical tradition of the Desert Fathers and so forth, and drawing parallels between that and Buddhism. So where I think theism, Christianity or other theism, I'm from a Hindu background, where it all, I think, starts to go silly is when literalism comes in, and then God is seen as a being or a thing in a universe of things, and then that being has to have characteristics, and before you know it, you can have a God of fear and judgment and revenge and all sorts of things, and then that's just I do think that's psychologically damaging. On the other hand, nihilism is psychologically damaging as well. Not believing that there's anything is probably the more prevalent thing in our culture at the moment. I don't know if that helps or not. Go
Yes,
on.
it does. Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
When I was a small child,
Yeah.
about 6 or so, I tried to understand things like eternity and God and what came before God. And as you were talking, I was thinking the trouble was I was trying to do this from a literal, rational point of view, and I didn't realise that no one could actually understand it from that point of view. I thought there was something terribly wrong with me because I couldn't understand that from a rational point of view, and the thing that appeals to me about Buddhism is that it does have this understanding of eternity, endlessness. It has ways of looking at that. And when I discovered quantum physics, I thought, oh, at last, there's a scientific view that isn't wholly rational, which makes a lot more sense to me. So I don't know where that fits into this argument, but...
Well, I think what you're getting at is another way of talking about how I think reason is limited, and Buddhism sees that, doesn't it? And of course, Buddhism's not anti-reason, it's not irrational, it's not saying that don't use reason. So reason is really, really helpful, and the ultimate truths about what life is, what consciousness is, what it is to be human, aren't going to be captured by reason, aren't going to be accessible to reason in the end. We've got to go beyond reason, and that will mean developing this other faculty that I guess we call Shraddha. Bhante sometimes talked about it as imagination. And Buddhism's quite careful not to fall into irrationality, but also see that there's another faculty that takes us beyond reason. And that's really valuable. And in a traditional culture, as I say, I'm from an Indian background. Even though I was brought up here, in that culture, there's still, I think, an acceptance, an everyday acceptance, that there is a meaning beyond this world of form. Even though there are lots of aspects of Hinduism that I disagree with and I think are silly, literal, and even cruel. At least in that culture, in Indian culture, there's an acceptance that there's something sacred. That sacred outlook, I think, is really, really important. And I think children have that sense of wonder. I mean, I did as a child. Hopefully we've still got a trace of it, even as adults, that capacity to open up to beauty, to something more than us. Sometimes it's through beauty, often it is, but it can also happen in love, in communication, a sense of not knowing, and happily not knowing, because there's something that is more than we can possibly grasp or know. And it just seems such a shame when that has leached away from our culture. And I think as Buddhists, we can try and live from that. And I'm sure as parents, if you live from that, you can at least imbue something of that in the life of your child, in the mind of your child. So yes, I think that seems to me the bigger thing. And then how you handle teachings on God for being, that's a tricky question within that bigger thing. Yes.
That really strikes a chord with me, because I think what I was saying is that our children are very exposed to quite strong messaging, well, certainly from my family.
Right, yeah.
Not even explicitly, just because we're in the middle of this very orthodox Muslim community. Yeah. But also, like for example, Finn started saying the other day, I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus Christ. So that's obviously coming from school.
Yeah, yeah, of course. He might also be rebelling against his parents, mightn't he?
Well, we haven't ever said to them, you're Buddhist.
Right, okay.
That's not the messaging, it's just, we don't want that. I think because I was so exposed to that, you're this, you're this, and it took me, decades to extricate myself from that. So I don't want to do to them what I had to, had imposed on me. So I think for us, but what you say about wonder and mystery, so I spend a lot of time just saying, well, our Salam friends, because that's what they call Muslims, so our Salam friends think this, and then Christians think that, Mummy and Daddy think this, and it's all very different. And I said, to be honest, no one really knows.
Yes.
And I make sure that messaging is coming across, because I've certainly settled in a place of what you say, comfort with uncertainty and mystery. And that's, to me, where my peace has come, finally, after years of being told, no, this is the truth, this is the truth. No, I don't quite get that truth. And realising that I could remove myself from that truth, and then thinking, now I've got to find another truth, and then realising, no, I actually don't. For me, it's the mystery that is where So for me, the messaging is very much, no one really knows. And so I spend a lot of time saying, but some people think this, and some people think that. And over the most sort of important questions, like what happens when we die.
Yes, that's
like,
right.
well, I can't give you the comfort that you want, because it's not there. I don't say that, but it's very much. No one, but in the not knowing is everything is possible.
Everything is possible,
And there's a...
I guess what also, I don't know how you do it, and of course at different ages it'll need different approaches, but even in the not knowing, somehow there might come a time when you have to actively counter the sort of nihilistic assumption which children will also be exposed to. So somehow from a Dharmic perspective, death really isn't the end. There is something more, and it's all right not to know what that is. That it is, but that it's also positive.
Yeah, Finn said once he wanted to be we did do the whole, you might turn into this or you might, but you might not. And our Salam friends live forever with everyone. But Finn said once, I want to be a motorbike.
I want to be a motorbike, that's great.
So that Daddy can ride me.
That's really sweet.
And then he figured out this way of, I'll be a baby bird, but then you can be my mummy bird. So he figured out this way that we could all stay together
connected.
as well.
That's very sweet, isn't it? That's lovely.
That's very lovely. And you just say, maybe. Because I don't know.
No, that's right.
I think it's really fascinating to explore how children can think about this sort of stuff. So I guess I just want to be able to sort of listen to kind of what Riley's emerging kind of understanding is, isn't it? As he gets older, and then sort of go from there. I mean, I think when I was growing up, the things that were difficult were the things that you kind of just couldn't pierce through and sort of engage with and talk about. But and that, what you said about having all that going on when you were 6 years old, I think that happens. Sometimes you underestimate how much children are sort of working out these theories. Quite, complicated. But I think that kind of stimulating that curiosity is really important.
It is important.
There's a lot more space in Buddhism, it seems, to just kind of
Yeah.
to explore.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember my first attempt at meditation was when I was 6, and it was an aunt of mine she used to meditate, and she sort of wanted to, I guess, teach my mother. So, you know, I was sat down as well, probably just to try and keep me quiet. And I can't remember exactly what we did, but I can remember having a sort of experience of something a bit unusual opening up. The experience I can really remember is seeing these little points of light, like stars, sort of cross the field of vision as I sat with, you know, it was, my eyes were closed, and then it was like this darkness with these points of light, and it was very comforting. And that image has stayed with me. You know, I'm now 52, and that image has stayed with me. That experience, that early experience, something was significant in that. And of course, I didn't know what meditation was, but it was even at that early age, I kind of thought this was something important, mysterious and important. So I think that's quite, for me, I'm glad that I was exposed to that sort of thing. And then when my dad died and I was 11, I think I had a sort of cultural background that said there was something mysterious and more. So then I was sort of even more curious as to, well, what happens after death then? Because I didn't believe it was the end, so then what's happening? So I'm glad that in my early conditioning there was that openness, which did give me a lot more, I don't know, tools for dealing with my dad's death. You know.
Did your family sort of speak to you?
Yeah, sort of. Probably not very explicitly, but I think in that sort of Hindu culture there was just an assumption that death wasn't the end, you know. And I think that's really, well, it did me a lot of good. Yeah. And then what it did was spark my curiosity, and I wasn't really able to explore that with my family that much. But by then I was sort of into my early teens, and then I could read, and you know, that I was interested in what, if death wasn't the end, what was the meaning of life? Why were we here if death wasn't the end? And I couldn't believe in God. I didn't believe in God, so I didn't believe that. You know, so that, and that was at quite a young age.
So
Yes, I
suppose what we're saying is that it might be our role to hold the mystery for them, even though they can't understand mystery when they're little, I think.
Yeah.
The concept of, that's why you wanted you to be a motorbike, because they're very concrete. Before the age of about 6, 7, when the others, the option of something less concrete appears, something more abstract.
Yeah.
So I do try to hold the mystery as much as I can, but sometimes the questions just flow and
You can't.
it's quite hard.
Yeah. I think engaging the children's imagination, when you do that, I'm sure, in lots of different ways. So then, having images of the Buddha around and stories of the Buddha, and that can, at least it gives them another alternative sort of myth. So it's not just the Christian myth or the Islamic myth, but there's another option.
I feel that mystery, you spoke about you as well, and yourself, it feels deeply important to me to say, well, we don't really know. But also I notice I want to reassure and comfort children around what happens after death. And with that faith that it's something immensely positive.
Yeah.
I say I will die and I'll be all right.
Yeah.
I'll be all right, you know.
Yeah.
And you'll still have me in you, within you. You'll remember me and I'll still be with you.
Yeah.
I remember my mum doing that. helpful because when she died I remembered those things. And it just allows children to approach it.
Perhaps we haven't got that long. I'll say a little bit about practicing for us, as it were. Shall I say something about reaction practice and see what you make of it anyway? It's an approach to practice which can, I think, be helpful in everyday life, but it's a wisdom practice. So I think it's sort of premised on quite a lot of assumptions. One is that we are open to something more, something beyond us, that there is an imaginative engagement with what lies beyond self-clinging. When I let go of a sense of me and mine, that something more opens up. So that's the sort of premise, that we have confidence in that. Also, there's a premise that there's some degree of metta in our experience. Yeah. So with those two sort of assumptions, what Subhuti has been teaching, this sort of reaction practice, is so when we react, when I let's take the example of getting angry, because I think this practice seems to be clearer working with anger and aversion than it is with craving. I think craving might be a bit different, although no doubt it can be applied. But say I get angry. Now normally, one way of working in Buddhist practice, of course, is the sort of to cultivate the opposite. So you get angry, you take responsibility for it. Now, I guess if you act unskillfully, you apologise and you confess and da-da-da-da. But say you catch it and you're just feeling irritated or angry, and you haven't yet acted unskillfully. So an ordinary shamatha approach would be to cultivate the opposite. You try and bring metta to the situation, or patience and perspective to the situation, etc. But this reaction practice takes a wisdom approach, which is a bit different. And what that is, that you try and go into your reaction inwardly, if you can. You really, really explore what it feels like to be reacting. So if I'm angry, so I try not to let that spill out into my behaviour, but really feel the sensations in the body, the tightening in the chest, the sort of even the sort of fiery sensation, the clenching. Also notice the story in the mind, the fact that there'll be some sort of story that says I've been hurt or hard done by, and this is, I'm going to get my own back, as it were. Notice the story and notice the sensations in the body. Bring awareness to that. Now, this is difficult to do, but ideally we bring awareness, with a sort of metaphor awareness into the experience and really go into the changing sensations in the body. I'm emphasising the body because it's good, if you can, to then let go of the narrative. The story in the mind isn't going to be that helpful for now, because it's normally to do with blame. One's either blaming somebody else or blaming oneself, but neither of those is going to be that helpful. So if you can clock that, oh yeah, there's this narrative of blame going on, but I'm not going to take that seriously. I'm going to stay with the physiological, the Vedana, the sensations in the body. That would be the first big thing. But I think that's a huge step in itself. Not acting out and then not believing, at least for now, not going with the story. Seeing if you can stay with the sensations. And then, if you can, You might not be able to do this in the moment. You might have to wait until you've got some quiet time. You go into it, if you ever get that. You try and sort of go into the sensations, and then you bring a dharmic reflection to your sensations. And the reflection that you can bring is, well, notice the shifting patterns of sensations, the emotions, they're shifting. If there's narrative there, notice that that's just thought. And the reflection you're trying to bring is that none of that is substantial, none of that is you. There isn't a me in there. They're just shifting, changing patterns of experience. Physical, emotional, volitional, narrative kind of thoughts. But all of that is empty of any substance. It's empty of the sense of there's a real me in any of that. And if you can bring that reflection while really experiencing the sensations, if you can bring the two together, there can be a sense of seeing through the whole construct of me having a reaction. You see through it, and there's a letting go. And what you're looking for is a sort of sense of ease and opening, both in the body and in the mind, a sense of letting go. It's a way of approaching our sort of arisings of hatred and craving by bringing a wisdom perspective into it. I don't know if that makes sense. I've probably not explained it very clearly. Does that?
Yeah, that's very powerful.
The reason I say that is, well, I want to actually backtrack from this and just bring out a bigger perspective. I really, really do believe that that Dharma practice is possible in different situations, in all situations. I'm not saying it's equally easy in all situations, but I do believe that enlightenment is possible. I do believe that insight is possible in any situation. So I guess what I'm saying is that as a parent, particularly if your kids are young and your hands are really full, your life is really full, not to give up on the wisdom element of Dharma practice. Insight can arise in any situation. A lot of it is to do with the perspective and the sort of mind that we bring to the situation. Now, of course, meditation can help prepare your mind, and I guess if you can have a meditation practice, even if it's a short one, then that's really, really helpful. But even if you can't have a regular meditation practice, I think you don't necessarily need to give up on the insight dimension of things in the moment, in the hustle and bustle of life. You can't afford to wait. I don't think it can be right to say, look, I'll wait until my kids have left home before I turn my mind to enlightenment, to serious practice. I don't think that can be right. So yes, see if you can keep bringing reflections on this, well, on any of the Lakshanas actually, on impermanence, on unsatisfactoriness, and this reflection on anatta, of insubstantiality. Bring it into your experience. As long as you're also cultivating shraddha, that there is something, when you do let go of me and mine, that the mind opens up, that consciousness opens up and can experience something beyond self that is supremely fulfilling, meaningful, beautiful. That's, in a sense, it's not outside of us. well, outside and inside stop making any kind of sense when the mind opens up in that way. So it's confidence in that. And really taking responsibility for what the mind is doing. That's really hard, isn't it? That's really, really hard, taking responsibility for what the mind is doing. Any thoughts on any of that?
Just some good comedy, really. Like in the midst of the chaos and the normal just shouting and power, and it'd be like, wait!
That's right, yeah.
My stomach is doing.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, shut up! I need to think
That's right. Yes, that's right. You might not get the response you want.
It'd be a surprise for them though. While they're coming out. Talking about power mode, and Mum said to me, well, I can't get out of the door in the morning to get him to school, to get him to school without power mode.
And that seems all right, doesn't it? I think Bante's teaching on love and power is quite explicit in saying power mode is okay as long as it's in service of the love mode. I don't think that we can ignore. We can't just ignore the power mode. You can't, can you? In whether you're a parent or not, actually. I mean, to help do anything in life, you have to sometimes act in a way that is decisive and determined. So sometimes that's necessary, but it is the overall purpose needs to be in service of the love mode. Yeah.
I just thought that just an amazing kind of skill to cultivate, because I'm a lone parent. It sometimes feels like you never kind of have time to do anything, and then you can kind of get resentful and bitter and angry, which isn't really helpful to anyone. So kind of realising that there's always space, you can always make space to be more. That's just really helpful.
It's helpful for me because like, I recognise the comment about you can't actually afford to wait till your parenting's over. Because there is that with me. I sort of think, well, I can't really do this seriously until they're at least a certain age, teenagers maybe. I need all the conditions to be in place. I need to be able to do my at least 14 minutes set or whatever every morning. Otherwise, but this is partly where I'm coming from. How can I do that? It sounds quite hard.
Yeah.
But that's no time to wait.
And with good meditation, do you find any time to meditate? Can you? I mean,
I have done at times. I mean, it's work is also difficult.
Of course, yeah. It's not just parenting. Yeah.
It's that just the thing, because I can get up early in the morning, but I tend to get up early in work. So
Yeah.
I could be probably.
I think with you that it has to be a 40 sit or nothing.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at
When we get up and do
next.
10 minutes, he's like, well, no point.
No point. Well, I can recognise that tendency in me, and I don't think it's helpful. I think lower your expectations if you can. Even 5 minutes is something. Like this reaction practice can be done in 5 minutes if you sit with yourself for 5 minutes and you notice that actually I'm feeling quite resentful and I'm quite angry. 5 minutes of this would be better than none. I'm told there was the Indian Buddhist teacher called Dharma. Have you heard of her? She was don't know much about her, but she was a very humble Indian woman, lived to quite a ripe old age, and she seemed to, what I've read of her is she seemed to just radiate love and compassion and be a real kind of force. But anyway, what little I have read of her, she was also no sort of slouch when it came to telling her disciples what to do. And she wouldn't take sort of, I'm too busy to meditate for an answer. She just wouldn't. And she was saying, well, you can do it for 10 minutes. Do it for 10 minutes. Don't say you can't. Yeah. So I think somehow lowering your expectations might, I don't know if that is the right way of putting it, but saying something is better than not.
I think it's really, in a way, quite freeing to look at a reaction practice, because I spend so much of the day in reaction to something or another that it's there all the time. It's not a very lived, alive thing in my experience. So it just feels like, if I focus on this a bit more, it's there. It's just that I choose to ignore it.
That's right. It's painful. It's painful, and so we look. But so really saying that for him now, and of course, he lives a very different life to most of us. But anyway, he says that you can get to a stage where you're actually looking forward to the reaction. You welcome it as an opportunity to practice, because there's something you can work with, rather than something that's just an obstacle. And I think as parents, you must have opportunities, as you say, to, your buttons must be being pushed all the time. You even work with children. And the buttons must be being pushed all the time. So there's plenty of material there. And rather than just think, okay, well, I'm constantly failing. Why am I getting irritated? Why am I getting resentful? Why am I getting angry? That makes me not a very good parent, good Buddhist, or whatever. Rather than thinking that, why not try and turn it around and think, okay, well, this is an opportunity to see the self coming to the surface. This is the self-clinging coming to the surface, the self not getting its way, life not working for me. That comes to the surface, and if you can bring an attitude that, okay, I'm really taking responsibility for my mind, and this is an opportunity to see through the delusion that my mind is creating of a fixed and separate entity called me. And have a perspective that if you do see through the delusion, something new and profoundly meaningful opens up. Something very, very freeing opens up. It's really easier said than done, so then if you're not able to do it, don't turn that into another thing to beat yourself up about. It's a hard practice, this, but it's something that's very, very practical as well.
Just a closing thought, I try to be a mindful parent, but I'm sometimes an angry parent too.
Of course.
And then they notice, the child does
of
notice.
Course.
They might be the first one to notice, you might not even realise your voice is going up. But one of the practices that's coming out of what you're saying is to just say to myself, there's anger in me.
That's right, yes.
Which is what Thich Nhat Hanh says, I think.
Right.
You are not angry, which that's what I tend to say. It's to say there is anger in me, because hopefully then the child can start to learn from that.
Yeah. No, that's right.
You could say that as well. Is that what you meant?
I
say
think
that.
if I say that, then he hopefully won't think, oh, she's angry with me, or it's more that there is this anger,
and that's not the whole story, as it were.
I think that's helpful, because I don't want
hide my experience of how I'm feeling from my children.
You probably can't
really
anyway, can you? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really important for them to know that because I always say to my children, when my daughter's 3 and she's got lots of emotions, and I try and help her by saying feelings come and go. So that's like one of our kind of family, my family traits, that you are feeling this now, but it will pass, and things don't go. But I often get caught into, I want to be honest and say, yeah, I am angry now, so I want to be honest, but actually you're right, it's a much better way of putting it. There is anger in me, I really think I'll take that.
Immediately, and for oneself, it's immediately a little bit more freeing, isn't it, to say there's anger in me. And then with this reaction practice, if you can start to delve into, well, where is the me anyway? There is anger, and there's these sensations and thoughts. Where is the me anyway?
Just this idea of creating more space. So I think, as we were saying, like parenting, working, you're just pulled from one person's needs to another person's needs, and there's often have that lack of space. And I feel like what you just described possibly could open up a bit of space that's sort of needed.
So it's just on 12:30, so probably we should wind up and go and pick up the kids and see if you can put this reaction practice into action. All right, thank you very, very much.